Test, test, test. Test, test, test. Test. Okay, folks, in a couple minutes we'll get started, okay? All ashore that's going ashore. Shabbat shalom, blessings. Will I be hearing from you this week, Phil? Am I in trouble? Shabbat shalom, blessings. All right. All right, folks, let's get started. I'm told that they will close the doors to the kitchen to keep it down, so that may be somewhat helpful. I don't have it. It's too bad. Okay. Let's go ahead and begin. And the format for this is going to be somewhat loose and comfortable. I have a microphone. We are broadcasting and recording this. So as people want to interact and participate, I would just ask you to use a microphone so that people in the great wide world can hear you and can hear what you have to contribute, because it's all valuable. So also encourage you to move closer and forward. That way we can kind of interact as a small group, as it were. So that's what we'll do. To begin with, I think what I would say is, how do I want to move forward here? Let's move forward like this. I'll go ahead and take your initial comments if you'd like. Does anybody have anything they'd like to comment on, or any question they'd like to follow up on regarding the teaching this morning, the message this morning, anything that we had to say? Anybody who have anything they want to say? Anyone? It's okay if you don't. You may not be warmed up. I'll get you warmed up here in a couple minutes. We'll get into the heavy lifting here in a minute. Okay, let's begin. And by all means, we can circle back and questions and comments and that sort of thing. So it's going to be fine. Okay. So what I have is I have a few more points and some more discussion, and what I'm feeling and what I'm sensing and what I'm thinking, could be wrong, but this is kind of just where I'm headed with this, is I just think that this is a major shift in paradigm in the way we look at the world vis-a-vis COVID, sickness, cancer, mental illness, things like this. And it has to do with this idea of when you're stymied, rather than just hanging out and waiting until we all get to heaven when everybody's going to be healed and made right, rather than just kind of parking yourself in that sort of orbit, and rather than chasing after all the miracle cures and chasing after all the doctor's cures, certainly turn over stones, and if you have a therapy or a treatment or something, go through the motions of getting those healings. Or if you know of somebody who has an anointing, or you come to the elders here and we'll pray for you, yeah, those are appropriate steps to take. But I think what I want to do is ground us, not in those sort of desperate places, but ground us in the center of the stream, which is a sense of contentment, just where we are, being comfortable just to occupy this space. Excuse me, just a second. Yeah, I got a taker. I got one here. David's usually good for it, although he's not real sure of this for some reason. Yeah. Anybody who goes east and south, I can put me in the trunk. Put up for bidding more. Who wants an extra 5 minutes with the rabbi? Captive audience. Let me tell you what I think about this. So yeah, if you guys just want to take off, that's fine. Yeah, perfectly fine. Sorry, I should have thought of that earlier. Sorry, I didn't. All righty, we're just family here, people, right? We're not on pretense. Okay, perfect. All right, so this is what I think is that there's something here, and I'm sorry if I haven't been able to kind of process it and package it and sell it to you as a tidy little bundle. There's still a lot of loose threads, right? There's still a lot of loose ends that I'm kind of processing and trying to figure out. So that's what I have for you is kind of, I want you to get this because I'm getting it, because I think it's really good, because I think this is where you live. I think this is a place where I can live. This idea of being grounded in the center stream of the waters and my roots going down, and these waters are no longer waters of bitterness. And the text uses bitterness, and I think what I would say is that word bitterness, it implies a lot of things. It doesn't just mean like, the bitter person in your neighborhood who's yelling at the kids, stay off my lawn, right? We all know that definition of quote unquote bitterness. Or the bitterness of Jacob when he's queried by the Pharaoh. He says, I've lived a long and difficult and sad life, right? That kind of bitterness. I think bitterness is also expressed in terms of resignation and disappointment. Bitterness is expressed in terms of futility. Bitterness is expressed in terms of faithlessness, some of these sort of things. So what I want us to do is get a sense of bitterness that is beyond that of like the stereotype of bitterness, so that we can see ourselves in the waters of bitterness. Because remember, we came to the waters and they were bitter. It's like, well, what's bitter? Who's bitter? Who's the they that's bitter? Maybe I'm the one who's bitter coming into this sort of thing. If you deal with mental health issues very much, you run into the brick wall of unforgiveness, and the ability to truly forgive becoming part of that key equation of deliverance and freedom. And unless you can really bear into forgiveness and walk through that road, which sometimes people can't even verbalize, right? Sometimes it takes some work to be able to verbalize unforgiveness. That's another kind of bitterness in my mind. So let's be open to the bitterness being a broader version or definition so that we can all kind of connect with it. All right. I'm going to extrapolate a little bit more beyond where we went today. Hopefully that'll get you thinking and get you up for some discussion. So let's begin. We're going to begin Exodus chapter 15, Shemot. Moshe led Israel onward from the Sea of Suf. That's the Sea of Reeds, Sea of Suf, Yam Suf. They went out into the Shur Desert. Okay, so let's stop right there. What does the Sea of Reeds remind us of? What is familiar about the Sea of Reeds? Yes? Moses in the basket, the reeds at the edge of the Nile, right? So already, when you think, what are we talking about here? The Sea of Reeds, the Yam Suf, is reminding us of that sort of encounter, that sort of experience. They went out into the Shur Desert, but after traveling 3 days in the desert, they had found no water. I spent quite a bit on that this morning. They arrived at Amidah, but couldn't drink the water there because it was bitter. This is why they called it Amidah, bitterness. 24. The people grumbled against Moshe and asked, "What are we to drink?" Moshe cries out to Adonai, and Adonai shows him a certain piece of wood. Again, for me, it's the etz, which means tree in its context, which he then threw into the water, made the water taste good. There Adonai made laws and rules of life for them, and there he tested them. And we might get around to talking about that sentence, because that's an interesting sentence here. Next frame. He said, "If you'll listen intently to the voice of Adonai your God, do what he considers right, pay attention to his mitzvot, and observe his laws." Next frame. "I will not afflict you with any of the diseases I brought upon the Egyptians, because I am Adonai your healer." This is all very familiar to us. We remember this, right? All right, next frame. Verse 27. Oh, say again.
That verse 26.
Okay.
Big word, if.
Okay. So go ahead, Phil.
Well, just that word if.
Mm-hmm.
If you will listen, then I will not afflict you.
Okay, since Phil has vocalized this, let's spend a little bit of time on it. If you'll listen intently to the voice of Adonai your God, do you think they're doing that?
They weren't.
Why weren't they? Anyone? Why weren't they listening to the voice of Adonai?
Children of Israel they just didn't.
I'll give you that they didn't frequently.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so they grumbled often and they got it wrong. But okay, so let's go ahead and
Go ahead.
continue a little bit more on that. Listen to the voice. Do what he considers right, okay? If you're listening to God and you hear him say, if, as Phil has said, you do what Adonai considers right, what would your mind say to that? How would you answer that question? What if your son said, well, what does Adonai consider right? How would you answer that question? Anyone? Hold up your hand for a microphone so you can be.
Keep his commandments.
Okay, what? Keep his commandments, Frida says. Any idea what his commandments are? Go ahead, Sherry.
Well, she just answered it. It's keep his commandments. And the thing about it is, of course, now it's different, because then they had to have the commandments, and Moses was have to put them down for them.
So read this narrative in their context, real time in their context. We have the benefit of hindsight, right? We have the benefit of having lived through it. We know the end of the story. Imagine you're there, you're by the waters, and Adonai says, if you keep my mitzvot, my commandments. What commandments is he talking about? See, it's not Torah yet, is it? It's not the covenant yet. We haven't been to Horeb. It's not the covenant, right? So what is it? What are his commandments? There's two answers to this. The first is, remember that during this period of history, Moses is judging every day, right? And everybody criticizes Moses for being the judge every day. But I submit to you that he was imparting God to the people. He wasn't just being a judge, he was being a father, which was why it was so traumatic when he was no longer their judge. He was replaced by just judges who had a job description, whereas Moses was the father.
They were complaining and feeling like, I don't know, because of their new situation.
There's probably some of that going on, absolutely. Frida?
I was just going to say they were being led day by day. They didn't have the Torah, but they were being given instructions every day.
That's very good. That's what I'm seeing here, is they were being given instructions. Jenny?
On the previous screen, can we go back one?
Go backwards. If you will listen intently to the voice of Adonai your God, do what he considers right, pay attention to his mitzvot, and observe his laws.
It wasn't on that screen. It was on the one where it says, and daily Adonai was teaching his ways.
I'm not sure that's here.
Was it daily? I just saw it a minute ago.
Keep all his decrees, pay attention to his mitzvot, do what is right. He made a statute and an ordinance there, and he tested them.
Right, that part.
And he said, if you diligently listen to the voice of Adonai, is that what you're thinking of?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So here's my take on it. You've got two things. You've got what Moses is imparting as a father to the people, the father-judge role, right? But you've also got something else. Woven in and through the narrative of the Exodus are these portions of Scripture, and I don't have them on your screen for you. But we've got, let's go back to Bo. Adonai says, go to Pharaoh and do this sort of thing, right? And then we have some instructions regarding the Passover, right? And what you're going to do for the Passover. Chapter 11, I'll bring one more plague. Chapter 12, Adonai spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land. And so this is the first of your months. This is your Passover. Take up the lamb, bring another family, etc., right? Whole assemblies to eat of it. So we've got instructions on the Pesach, the memorial to keep it throughout your generations, right? And then in verse 14 and following of chapter 12, we've got the ordinance on the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is tangential to Pesach, but not the same thing, right? And we talk about that. We talk about how to pick out the land, how to pick out the lamb. When you come into the land, Adonai will give you as he's promised. You are to keep this ceremony. Explain it to your children. And then we also have, and I'm not seeing it right here, we also have instructions on the firstborn, chapter 13, right? The redemption of the firstborn, okay? So what you could say is that these instructions that were given at the place of your healing over bitterness is kind of, once again, Torah light, right? Or covenant light. It's a few instructions to kind of get you down the road, along with the relationship that you have with Moses, who is interpreting and imparting Adonai to you. So this is what I see, is I come to Adonai as a believer, I come into covenant with him as a believer, and I come into a measure of healing, right? And I come into a measure of obedience, but I don't understand all the covenant. But I'm walking with him and I'm obeying him, and it's that sense of like living in that sort of environment that propels me or gives me sort of momentum in this journey of healing, in this journey of righteousness. And this is why that's important, because sometimes we get ourselves stuck on this idea that everything is all or nothing. We've got all covenant or nothing. And really, in one sense, it says in the New Testament, if somebody's guilty of breaking one aspect of the law, he's guilty of breaking all of the law. And yes, I understand that, but in a sense of learning to live in community under the covenants, I don't expect all of you to understand all the obscure laws of the Torah, or understand all that. It's an idea of, and remembering what we're doing, we are reinventing humanity here. We are creating a new man here. You are a resurrected being. You are completely different from where you were. And so what's happening is you are changing in such a profound way. You're not expected to get it all right all the time, all at once. So that's what I would say to that. All right. Says, if you will listen intently to the voice of Adonai God, do what he considers, I will not afflict you with any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, because I am Adonai your healer. Let's continue with the point that I was going to make. We may circle back to this because there's some aspects of that are really fascinating. Can you skip down to verse 27, Sean? They came to Elim, where there were 12 springs, 70 palm trees, and they camped there by the water. And this is the final parsha reading for this parsha. And notice the difference in tone here. So what we had is we're out of water. We're grumbling against Moshe. We ask for water. He throws a tree into the waters. The waters are bitter, then the waters tasted good. Adonai made rules in life for them, and they travel on, and they come to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there by the water. It's a change. All right? So what do we see in the 12 springs and 70 palm trees? What do those speak to you of? 12 springs? We'll start with that. What does 12 springs remind you of? Anyone?
12 tribes of Israel.
12 tribes. 12 tribes of Israel. Very good. Okay. And what about the 70 palm trees?
The nations.
70 nations came out of Noah in the 70 nations. What is the pattern that we saw vis-a-vis Israel and the waters? Remember? It's the Etz Yam, the tree, the Etz in the midst of the waters. Okay? All right, let's extrapolate that pattern to this new location, Elim. And what would that look like? Anyone? If before it was Israel, the tree, in the midst of the waters of Adonai, right? Then what do we have now using the same pattern? Anyone?
It looks like Israel is the water.
Israel is the water, and
And
the nations are the trees. Where Israel was in the waters, now Israel is the water, and the nations have become the trees. And the nations are in the midst of the waters. Do you see the pattern? Israel is in Adonai, and the nations are in Israel. I used to teach, I've always taught that the kingdom of Adonai is like a cork on the waves. You've probably heard me say that if any of you remember, right? And we're just like, the kingdom of Adonai just bobs along on the waves, right? And the societal waves move here and there, and the cork never sinks. It's never damaged. It just bobs along, because that's what the kingdom is like, right? But I'm starting to think that maybe that's wrong. What if it's the nations of the world that are immersed in us, the kingdom? So consider this. This is the paradigm, right? You've got, right, Adonai, Elohim, right? He goes infinitely that way, that way, that way. He's everything, right? And what he did is he carved out a shell, if you will, that was going to be our existence. And he carved it out of himself, because it had to have come out of himself, right? He's eternal, so there's no place that he's not. He's omniscient, omnipotent, all-powerful. He's everywhere, right? So he carved out of himself to make a space for us, and that was our universe. And then out of that, he carved the Garden of Eden, which was a special space, right? And out of the creation of all the animals and things, he carved the man and woman, a special space for him to dwell, right? So we've got these sort of layers, the Mishkan, the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, the temple is a carved out space where the presence of Adonai dwells, right? And so we've got these concentric layers of going greater to smaller or greater to more focused. And it's always for him to carve out something for us. We think of ourselves as either looking for a sanctuary in the world, like this building here, these 4 walls, is a sanctuary. You walk through that door and people talk about how peaceful it is in here, right? This is a sanctuary from the great world out there. We've got mahjong and we've got fishermen and a bar, right? We're surrounded by that. So we're this little enclave. We're this little sanctuary bobbing along in the waves. I appreciate the spiritual power of that image. What I'm suggesting to you is perhaps it could just as well be inverted. That it's the kingdom of God, and it is the world that is carved out or somehow isolated. That we're the ones who are surrounding the world. Do you see what I'm saying? It's just an image and it's just something to play with, but that's kind of what I'm seeing here is, in one sense, Israel is implanted or replanted in the waters of Adonai, and the world is planted or replanted in the waters of Israel. And isn't that what we see? It is the Goyim who are grafted in. Okay. All right, I don't want to belabor the point. Any other comments on the palm trees and the 12 tribes, the 12 springs? What else is remarkable about the narrative of 12 springs? What's that? We're in chapter 15.
No, but where is it on the map?
Oh, I don't know. I think it's a day's journey or something to that effect from where they think Mara was. And this is, they're meandering around on their way to Mount Horeb.
I was just curious
Yeah.
about where that was like.
Yeah. So for me, what I trip up on is we went from waters to waters. Like, aren't we done with waters now? Like, you would think, okay, here we are coming up on waters. I wonder what these waters are going to have in store for us, right? It's like, haven't we got enough of the waters? Look at Numbers 33, if you will, please. If you have a Bible, you can turn there. I will read it to you. We'll also have it on the screen as well. Numbers 33. Numbers 33 is a bit of a travelogue, right? We have a narrative of they went here and they camped, they went there and they camped, they went there and they camped. All right. They moved on from Panei Hachirot. This is Numbers chapter 33, verse 8. Passed through the sea to the desert, continued 3 days' journey into the Etam desert, and camped at Mara. This is the narrative we just read, right? And then what do we read? Next frame. They moved on from Mara and came to Elim. Incidentally, Elim in the Hebrew would be pronounced Elimah, which means terebinth, right? You know that word? Elimah?
No, I thought it was possible that Elimah means toward Elim, like Shemaima.
Right. Yeah. To the trees, I think is what it means. But we can check that. Hold on, I may have gotten that wrong. I'm not a scholar, I'm a student. All right. So let's continue. They moved on from Mara. They came to Elim. In Elim were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, so they camped there. Next frame. They moved from Elim and camped by the Sea of Suf. So now where have we returned to? The Sea of Reeds, right? And they camped there. Do you see what's happened here? It's like we went from the waters of bitterness, we got the tree of healing, then we went to the 12 springs and 70 palms, which had to have been some kind of oasis with all of its spiritual meaning, but had to have been just a very pleasant place. But again, we're dealing with water, and then we return back to the Sea of Reeds. And what was the Sea of Reeds? The Sea of Reeds is a place of our victory over the Pharaoh, right? Or Adonai's victory over the Pharaoh. But it's also the reminder of the reeds of the Nile. Right? But we're going to camp there now because we can return to the scene of the crime because we've been healed. That's what I'm reading. Any comments or thoughts on that? What was the Yam Suf? The Yam Suf was the Sea of Reeds, the site of the destruction of Pharaoh. Remember, his horse and his rider have fallen in the sea, because at some point the world will be immersed in the waters of Adonai, the same as Pharaoh's army was. And those waters that they are immersed in will either be waters of healing, if they're believers, or waters of judgment, if they're non-believers. So they return to the scene of their bitterness in order to reap the harvest of joy. Any thoughts? Yes. What's that?
I said, were they on their way to Mount Sinai after that?
Yeah, after that they were working their way towards Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai. That's right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Did you want to talk?
I'm just trying to see, I'm just trying to get a picture of their
Mhm.
journey for some
Right.
reason. The geographical location helps me.
Right.
What was the period of time here, Rabbi?
The time frame, how many weeks?
Yeah.
I don't have an answer for that.
Uh,
I could do some digging, but I don't
The-
know off the top of my head.
The study that I've done here is about a 1 year's period of time come from the Shamash.
Yeah, I think I've read that too somewhere.
Yep.
Which is interesting, especially when you consider the 1 year mourning for those who are mourning the loss of somebody, And isn't that kind of the scenario in a time of tyranny or oppression or persecution? You can't properly mourn the things you've lost, right? I mean, you can't properly mourn the baby that was killed at the hands of the Nazis or the hands of Pharaoh because of just the climate. And isn't that the expression of some people vis-a-vis COVID? We couldn't properly mourn, couldn't properly grieve, couldn't properly gather. Any other comments? Let's see if I can find that other part that I wanted to touch on. Planted, be uprooted, leaves, the healing leaves, sprouting the fig. Jeremiah 14. Maybe we'll do that. Maybe we'll look at Jeremiah 14 if we get time. Okay. So, all right. Let's look at Jeremiah 17. And I want to give you a chance to interact and perhaps contribute to the discussion vis-a-vis my point on humanism. Again, this idea that it is the nature of modern humanity to try to improve his world and gain control and gain mastery over his world. So what is one of the ways that Adonai gets people's attention in the ancient world? It has to do with food production.
Disasters?
Disasters is good, yeah. What's another one that we see more often than disasters?
Diseases?
Diseases. How about droughts? Droughts. So you're tied to a production agrarian sort of environment where you have to produce your food, and you're tied to rainwater. You're tied to the rains falling on your crops in order to irrigate your crops. And very quickly, what man tries to do is he builds cisterns to capture the water, and then he builds mechanical devices to move that water around. But aren't you still sort of in a drought weather dependency? Well, what do we have in the modern age? In the modern age, if you're in farming, I remember when I lived out west, we had these huge things called pivots. Anybody know what a pivot is? Yeah, David does, Phil. And what it is the wellhead that goes way down deep in the ground, sometimes several hundred feet down, and tying into these deep, deep aquifers. And then the top of this wellhead is the center point of a giant sprinkler. And I think these fields would be 640 acres and this big, long sprinkler would just go pivoting around, and it would sprinkle that whole thing. Now, in that environment, you don't need to depend on Adonai's favor for rain. Right? Because we have technologically mastered water. Because we've managed to harness both the atom and the oil molecules, we are able to create enough energy to move water around from great depths and then move it around on the surface of the land. So now it doesn't matter. Our food does not depend on. And now, because of that, we can centralize the production of our food, right? So all of our food now can be grown in Nebraska. And the rest of the country isn't needed for food production because we can grow everything we need to eat in Nebraska. I'm exaggerating, of course. But do you see what I'm saying? We can centralize food because we're not dependent on rain. There's no way that Nebraska, the little clouds over Nebraska, are going to create enough rain to feed the entire country. But if we can sink down these pivots and draw all the water out of the ground, then yeah, we can produce food in a centralized area, which does two things. It means that now all these people outside that area have no concept where food comes from. They have no connection to the source of food. Who is their food provider now? It's the production system. It's the transportation system. My theory is that humanism has created that whole sort of train, and now we are isolated from the production of food. And we have no connection to Adonai for our food other than the 22-second prayer we say before we eat. It used to be, and part of the Amidah, we don't do it here, but you would in a traditional community. Do you remember the Amidah where you pray for rain during the fall, right? Why do you pray for rain? Because rain is absolutely important. It's required. They actually changed the Amidah during the seasons to make sure that we're praying for rain in its season. May you have rains in their seasons, right? Did we used to do that here? Yeah. It was considered too much work for not enough understanding. Any thoughts or comments? So this is my thought, is that's what it's speaking about when Jeremiah 17 says this, verse 5, here's what Adonai says, a curse on the person who trusts in humans, who relies on merely human strength. And for me, this is just such a gracious way to put it. I know it's a translation, I know it's Stern's translation, but for me it's just a very nice way to put it. Because, yes, I trust on humans for my bread, don't I? I go to Publix and I buy my bread with the few dollars in our pocket, right? But you know what? I don't merely trust in humans. I trust in humans because that's part of the economy and the system we live in. But I try to include God when I can, and I trust him. So it says, a curse on the person who trusts in humans, who relies merely on human strength. I don't rely merely on human strength. I tie myself and I bind myself to Adonai, knowing that he's the one who has provided for everything. Okay. Whose heart turns away from Adonai, he'll be like a tamarisk in the Aravah. And I don't know how much I touched on this morning, but I just found this very, very powerful. This idea of a tree growing in the desert that is indifferent to whether or not it rains. I mean, imagine that. A tree growing in the desert that doesn't care if it rains or not. And you have the image of the modern humanist. Right? I'm self-sufficient. I live in a desert, but I don't care. I live in a wasteland of morality and truth, but I don't care. I don't care if Adonai blesses us or doesn't bless us because everything is managed by my own hand. He'll be like a tamarisk in the Aravah. When relief comes, it is unaffected. In other words, when the drought ends and there's rain, it's unaffected. When Adonai comes and he brings mercy and he brings blessing, it's unaffected. And isn't that the story of the modern agnostic or person who's indifferent to Adonai? It lives in the sun-baked desert in salty, uninhabited land. Next frame. Blessed is the man who trusts in Adonai. Adonai will be his security. And then it sets up the contrast. And this is where we live, is in the trust of Adonai. He'll be like a tree planted on water. We talked about this morning. Or even if you want to just use near water. And look what it says there at the end of verse 8. Next frame, please. It is not anxious in a year of drought, but keeps on yielding fruit. And again, I'm sorry, but I am kind of stuck on this 2 Kings 19 passage. Root goes downward, trees go upward to bear fruit. Look what it says. It is not anxious in a year of drought. Why are you not anxious in a year of drought? Because you're planted in the waters. There's no reason to be anxious in a year of drought. Otherwise, the practical answer is, well, I'm anxious in a year of drought because I'm waiting for it to rain. But that's the definition of a drought, right? It's not going to rain. If Adonai's judgment is on the land and it's not going to rain, then what am I saying? I'm not anxious because I don't care? No, I'm not anxious because I'm planted in the waters. The spiritual turmoil of the earth right now, vis-a-vis COVID, and all the other dynamics that are going on in the world. That sort of spiritual turmoil, we can be not anxious in years of turmoil, the same way this writer is not anxious in a year of drought, but keeps on yielding fruit. How do you yield fruit? You go down, the root goes down, the branches go up, and you yield fruit. And this again goes back to this 2 Kings 19 passage that I'm really excited about these days. And then we've got this, verse 9, the heart is more deceitful than anything else and mortally sick. And now we've pivoted again and we're talking about health. We're talking about the heart being sick. Throne of glory, exalted from the beginning, our holy sanctuary. Verse 13, hope of Israel, Adonai. Again, what is that word hope? Mikvah. The mikvah of Israel, Adonai. All who abandon you will be ashamed. Those who leave you will be inscribed in the dust because they have abandoned Adonai, the source of living water. And then he says this, verse 14, next frame, heal me, Adonai, and I will be healed. Save me, and I will be saved, for you are my praise. And you see that the circles just wind them way back to the healing. The person who trusts in humans relies on human strength. That strength, zera'o, a heart who turns from Adonai. But when relief comes, the drought ends, assuming a life of trouble. That's the deception of the enemy, that we can overcome life's troubles in our own strength, technology, creativity, genius, wisdom, etc. Right? I love technology. I'm a technological kind of guy. I got technology things, and I try to solve puzzles with technology. It's kind of a weakness of mine, if you want to say it that way.
But you don't have a pointer.
I wanted a stick. I would have been fine with a broom handle.
No, I can't see you with a stick. You gotta have one.
I'd be afraid that I'd be making a point and start doing Star Wars with you guys.
Just don't point it at a person.
Well, that's my fear. I'd like to get excited and wave it around, and I'd have people.
Sorry.
That's okay. All right. That's the deception of the enemy, that we can solve these problems in our own strength. Go ahead.
You can use all the technology you want to tap into the deep aquifers and water the land. But if the aquifers don't refill by God's hand, what's all your technology going to do for you?
Yeah. Yeah, it's you. On the one hand, yes, I agree with you. You're absolutely right. And the aquifers are recharged by rainwater and runoff. And yeah, I used to do that kind of thing. Okay, so I understand that. However, the amount of water down there in these subterranean aquifers is immense. It's incredible. It's like they say, if we were to use all the oil, at current rates, we'll run out of the reserves in 200 years or some crazy amount like that, right? There is so much oil down there. Well, it's like that. There's water down there. And it really would take us an awful long time. And then you go to places like Santa Barbara. Anybody familiar with Santa Barbara? So all throughout California, especially Southern California, you're not allowed to irrigate your yard. You're not allowed to have green grass. You're not allowed to wash your car, so on and so on and so forth, because water is very scarce. They actually bring water to Los Angeles from Lake Tahoe, right? Up in the mountains. Yeah, some of it comes from the Cascades, all the way up near the Oregon border. They're bringing water to Los Angeles, Southern California. It's 800 miles, or some more than that. It's probably 1,200 miles. They bring water that far. Santa Barbara looked at the tea leaves of life, and they built a desalination plant way back in maybe the 70s, I think it was. And they get their water from the ocean, and they desalinate it. And now in Santa Barbara, you can irrigate your lawn, you can wash your car. It's the only place in Southern California where you can do that. It's a beautiful city. It's very expensive, but that's where you can do that, right? So, yeah, if we were to use up the aquifers, well, we can just start desalinating and make that work, because we're technologists. We're going to solve the problems. But what was Bavel? What was Babel? They bricked bricks, right? That's what the text says. They bricked bricks. They made bricks, and they used bricks instead of stone. And it says they used bitumen, tar, instead of mortar. It's repurposing things for a different purpose. That's all what technology is. I'm going to take this, contraption, wheel, whatever it is, and make it do something for me that it wasn't originally designed to do. I'm repurposing things. So that's what we have. Let's see. But the dilemma and the quandary is, of course, that technology doesn't really heal the deep injuries. And even some of your doctors will tell you this. I can help the body heal, but it's the body that heals itself. Well, my translation of that statement is a doctor can help the body heal, but it's God who has put a process in place by which the body heals. So, do you see what's happening here? All right. Everything comes back to healing. Everything kind of floats around, and we touch back on healing. And here we have this phrase, heal me, Adonai, and I will be healed. Save me, and I will be saved, for you are my praise. And isn't that the cry of a desperate, broken humanist? Heal me, and I'll be healed. Right? It's the person who went through chemotherapy, but they're still injured at the process. Right? Their heart's injured. It's the person who got all the right treatments from COVID, but just the trauma of having spent 41 days isolated in an ICU in another state. How does that get healed? Well, it's heal me. If you, Adonai, heal me, I will be healed. A big part of humanism is the strength. We brute force technologies to solve problems. The opposite of that, human strength, is Adonai, and it is his strong arm that is our strength. From Devarim, chapter 26, verse 8, Adonai brought us out of Egypt with a strong hand and a stretched out arm, with great terror, with signs and wonders. Isaiah 53, who believes our report, to whom is the arm of Adonai revealed? Isaiah 59, skipping ahead, Sean, Adonai's arm is not too short as to save. And Isaiah 62, Adonai is sworn by his right hand and by his mighty arm. Never again will I give your grain to your enemies as food, nor will strangers drink your wine for which you work so hard. Isaiah 63, verse 5, I looked, but there was no one to help me. I was appalled that no one upheld me. This is a prophetic reference to Yeshua. Therefore my own arm brought me salvation. Again, what do we see? We see that his deliverance is tied to healing, that healing comes by virtue of this miraculous moment, this medical process, but then there is deliverance, and deliverance is what comes from Adonai. When you immerse yourself in Adonai is when you break free of the bondage and the tyrannies of sickness and illness. Now, saying all this and really bearing into some of the kind of almost psychology of the spirituality of our world, I wouldn't hesitate to have any one of you, if you came to me and said, I've got this or I've got that, I'd say go see a doctor. Because I believe that there's medical miracles. My daughters, Ryan and Zoe, the twins, they had in utero surgery. They were operated on at 19 weeks gestation. Before they were born, they were operated on. Medical miracle. They actually, because of a complication in the placenta, they had to take the uterus out, operate on the twins, and then put the uterus back in. And so one of the technicians, one of the nurses, during surgery actually held the uterus in her hands while these doctors worked on the placenta and worked on these little babies. And we've got somewhere in our stuff, we've got a video of the surgery, and we're in there looking at the amniotic fluid, right? And then all of a sudden there's a nose flies by. You see a nose go by, and I was like, there's a nose. And you can tell who it is. It's Ryan's nose, And then another place you see a heel. This is 19 weeks. And this is a surgery they did. Medical miracle, I'm sorry. They were given a 10% chance to be normal, Ryan and Zoe. And Ryan was here this morning, and they're normal. I mean, they're not normal, but they're normal. They're good kids. But medical miracle. And I would be the first to say to anybody like Tim who has leukemia, yeah, go see the doctor and go through the paces, do what they tell you to do. But at the same time, yes, I'll pray for you and anybody else, and I'll have you go to somebody else. If somebody here is sick and Amy tells me that she knows a faith healer in Cape Coral, yeah, let's go. Let's go turn over the stones. Absolutely, 100%. But what do we do when those two sort of healing moments don't deliver? There's no special prayer, even the mikveh that we're doing. If Adonai should choose to heal anyone, Baruch Hashem. But rather what I'm asking is that you get connected and restored to Adonai. Let's look at, if you will, please. It's going to be Jeremiah 14. And I touched on this morning, but I really feel like it's an important point to make. I don't think you have this in your notes up there, Sean, sorry. Jeremiah 14. Verse 8. O hope of Israel, Savior in time of trouble, why are you like a stranger in the land, like a traveler who stays for a night? Why are you like a man overcome, like a champion who cannot save? Yet you, Adonai, are in our midst, and we are called by your name. Do not forsake us. It kind of flips the narrative, kind of flips the script a little bit. Verse 8, you, hope of Israel. Again, there's that hope word, which again, I'm pretty sure in this in the Hebrew is mikveh. Savior in time of trouble. So we're talking about Mashiach here. Why are you like a stranger in the land, like a traveler who stays for a night? What does that remind us of? It reminds us of our stay in Egypt. We were strangers in the land, foreigners, right? We're foreigners in the land. Why are you like a man overcome, like a champion who cannot save? Remember, the Israelites were described as being mighty. They were described as covering the ground and being mighty. What were they? They were a champion who cannot save. They were fettered by virtue of their slavery, tyranny, their psychology, their injury. Why are you like a stranger in the land? Why are you like a man overcome, a champion who cannot save? Yet you, Adonai, are in our midst, and we are called by your name. Do not forsake us. This is again, I talked about flipping the script. Instead of us being in him, he's in us. But he's in us so that we can learn to be in him. And again, for me, to be immersed in him is expressed in the mikveh in such a positive and profound and physical way. And that's why, much to my wife's chagrin, I called for a community mikveh at the beach, and apparently the water is going to be unfit. But we'll see who shows up. I'll be there.
I'll be there.
You want to be there? Okay. Yeah, that's one thing about it. I won't have to stay out there for very long. My daughters were baptized into salvation when we did all four of them at the same time, and I think they were all like 10 to 13 or something like this. Did all four of them at the time, and there was a big group that was doing it at a friend's house, and it's a bunch of young people who just received salvation. And so my daughters were going to do this, and the people were going into the pool, and I think it was January or February at the time, and they were just like, oh, it's so cold, And I'm like, so I told the girls, I said, because they're girls, right? They're teenage girls, and I said, just don't freak out, okay? It might be a little cold, just don't make a scene. That's not why we're here. We're here for a different purpose, not to be over dramatic and be all silly and make a big scene, right? And so it came our turn, and I went in to go in first. And I stepped into the water, and I just went, oh, I couldn't breathe. It was so cold. And so they came in dutifully one at a time, and I prayed for them, and I did the blessing over them, and I do what I do because I do what I do, and it's like, okay, you're done, next. Next. The last one comes in. Let's go. It was so cool. It can't be as bad as that, right? I'm sure. All right. Any questions or comments or thoughts on everything that we've talked about today? There we go. Yes, Diane.
Oh, yes, we're broadcasting.
Is there fruit from the tamaric tree, and is it edible?
I believe so. I know it flowers, and I believe there's a fruit, but I don't know the answer to that 100%. But that's an interesting discussion. And for me, it makes perfect sense, right? Because there is fruit from humanism. I mean, look at the world. Look at transportation, the advancements of medicine, the advancements in science and astronomy and transportation, all these things, knowledge, art and everything. We live in a very advanced society. We live at a level of wealth never seen in the history of the world. All that's the product of humanism. I'll give you that. So there is fruit to it, but it comes at a cost. And the trick is being able to live in this world, but be immersed in Yeshua, which is why I'm kind of flipping the script and saying, well, I'm tapped into the eternal, infinite waters of the most powerful creator God in the universe. I'm not bobbing around in your waters. I'm planted in these waters. And how about you come to me, and I'll introduce you to the waters of life. I'll replant you in these waters. And if it needs to be that way, I'll replant you in me. Do as I do, Paul said, right? Follow me as I follow him. And I do think there's something to be said for that idea that we can go to the world and say, be like a tree planted in Israel, as Israel is planted in Adonai. I don't know, it's an interesting idea. Any thoughts, any questions? Anyone else? Nothing? Let me off easy? That was an hour. That was fun. All right. Thank you all so much for your time. Thank you for your indulgence. And may Adonai bless you and give you a good week. Send me an email or comment or text, or let me know if you have any questions or any thoughts as you go. Phil, I'll expect your 3,000 words presently. Thank you. Shalom, shalom.